I'm Roger Ellis. I was born in Chicago, Illinois on the 18th of May in 1943.
Okay. What was your early childhood like in Chicago?
It was great until my dad passed away. That was when I was about 9 years old. We grew up in a suburb there, which was upscale, I guess, Riverside, and very nice neighborhood, post-war. First thing I remember watching ever on TV was the explosion at the nuclear bomb out in the Pacific. And of course, that wasn't until after World War II, immediately after. And I guess you'd say it was pretty normal upbringing. I went through parochial schools there. And I was a fairly normal, average kid, I guess you'd say. Nothing special to report there. Mom and Dad, and I only had one brother, older brother. And we just lived a perfectly happy, typically American life, I guess. Yeah.
What was high school like?
Well, high school I experienced in California. After my dad passed, my mom bundled my brother and me off and moved to California, where she always wanted to live. So we ended up in a place called San Jose, California, and I finished school there, elementary, and then went right into a prep school. I went to Bellarmine, that's a Jesuit prep school, for 4 years. And the Jesuits beat the hell out of me because they were pretty tough and pretty rigorous. Rigor at that time, spelling fists, which I think no longer applies. So I learned classical Greek and Latin for 4 years, theology, as well as all kinds of physics and chemistry, literature, and all that good stuff. Enjoyed it, I really did. A great bunch of friends I had. And it was really nice, no problems at all. I loved it. My brother had a hard time. He went through Bellarmine too, but he didn't do as well as I did. He was always the athlete type. I always liked stuff like studies and reading and history and literature and all that. So I didn't mind it. I really kind of took to academics with them, which pleased the Jesuits no end, They kind of left me alone, except once in a while, I got... how shall I say, naughty. And since I was one of the smart ones, when I got naughty, they would have me push a penny with my nose around the cinder track out by the field house. The athletes, when they got naughty, they'd have to memorize 30 or 40 lines of Shakespeare, right? So I got the cinder track nose. But, it was nothing. And back then, of course, there were no problems with drugs, with alcohol, and I never had a car in high school. I never was running around, and that sort of thing. It was a whole different world, as you probably remember, back in the late 50s and until the early 60s when I started college.
Did you have any idea in high school what it is? Because you're always being asked by teachers and whatnot, what is it you're going to do when you grow up? What were the kind of things you were interested in that you thought you were going to be doing after high school, so to speak? Go to college, become something else, what?
I had two things I wanted to do more than anything. One was to be a writer, and the other was to join the Foreign Service. Most immediately, I started as a writer. I was always good with writing, so I wrote a whole bunch of short stories and things of that sort. But by the time I graduated, I wanted to go on to college. There was no question in my mind, and that would be somewhere back east. I wanted one of the Big Ten, I thought, and so. That I thought would help me because I liked, as I said, the notion of being overseas, traveling overseas, and I thought, well, Foreign Service sounds pretty good, so I pursued that at the end of high school. As far as careers go, that's the main thing that I was setting my sights on. So When I got to college, I chose a major in, I wanted a major in theater, but the college I eventually chose, they didn't have that, so I went to English, specialized in dramatic literature and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And were you aware of what was going on in the world around that time? We're talking about the early 60s now that you were going to college?
Yeah. I mean, I was aware. At that time, I wasn't aware of too many political things. There was no Vietnam conflict hadn't started up yet. That didn't start till Kennedy started heating things up. In fact, when I started college, I thought, gee, it might be really fun to be an officer, you know. So at that time, the universities had these highly developed ROTC programs. So I went away, my first year went to the University of Notre Dame down in Indiana, and I thought I'll be a naval officer, just like all those movies I'd seen about the war, World War II. That was a time when, after World War II, Hollywood was cranking out a lot about everything that happened in World War II. So I thought Navy'd be great. I'd love to sail. You know, I wasn't very much in favor of walking around the world in the infantry and flying. So there I was. I enrolled in the Naval ROTC. But then after I transferred from Notre Dame to another university, the only ROTC program there was Army, so I continued in that for a year before I began to realize what the problems were, and around the world especially. Vietnam was starting to heat up then. I think that was about 1961, 62, 63, and then I lost interest in that and finished out my university years as an undergraduate, getting more and more radicalized. And then, of course, that was the same time I became even more aware of the counterculture. That was the early going into the mid-'60s. And through music, through pop arts, you know, bands like the Beatles and others, and I became aware of not just music, but the social protest, the social issue. Things were heating up against the war in Asia. So that's when I started down the road of being not more critical about like the war involvement, and as you say, becoming more and more aware of things around me.
Do you remember, do you have any memory of the day that Kennedy was shot?
Yeah, I was studying overseas then. That was one of the reasons I left Notre Dame, was they didn't allow any foreign studies, and I knew I wanted to go overseas somewhere. So by that time, what was that, 63? I was spent a year in Rome at University of Loyola, and so I was, at that time, I was in Paris. I was on a vacation from school with my buddies there, and I remember that we were standing on a subway platform, metro in Paris, and a couple of Frenchmen came up and said, "Hey, you know, your president's just been assassinated." I don't know nothing, you know, and until we finally looked at a newspaper and realized it. So that's how I learned about that.
What was the reaction around you by the Parisians?
I don't know.
Okay.
At that time, I wasn't speaking a whole heck of a lot of French, and I didn't know. I mean, I had no experience of what that meant to lose a president in midterm. I mean, I hadn't been aware of anything when FDR passed and Truman took over, but this was pretty serious. I knew everyone was, they're uptight and all this sort of thing, but aside from that intellectual knowledge, I didn't feel anything. It wasn't any sort of anger or resentment or desire for vengeance or you know, anything. It was just a kind of shock. It was sort of my first big introduction to politics. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in Catholic school,
Mm-hmm.
and I, like you, I really didn't have any sense of, it's a president, okay, I kind of get that part, but then when they had the high mass, and I mean, it was just a huge thing.
Oh yeah, because he was a Catholic president. Yeah. We knew that, but you know, it didn't really affect me. I was starting to get very critical of all the things the United States was involved in. And then, of course, the president assassinated, and following him, the Southeast Asia theater started heating up. So it wasn't until really after I graduated, about my senior year, that it became serious.
What did you graduate with? What was your BA?
My BA was in English. They called it dramatic literature.
Okay. So once you returned back to the States, two questions. One,
Returned
return to the States.
after the Vietnam experience?
No. This is after you got back from Paris.
Oh, yeah, right.
Okay, so you returned from back, now you graduated, you returned back to the States, right? What were your immediate plans, and then how did those plans get interfered with?
Well, I wanted to keep involved with theater studies, especially theater performance. So I chose to stay at the University of Santa Clara. That's where I earned my bachelor's, and decided to go to a master's program in dramatic lit there, which would allow me to work with some really creative people in the theater program, do plays, write plays, and do that. So I did that for 2 years, and they wooed me by offering me a teaching assistantship for a couple of years, so I could actually earn money teaching in the English department and go to school at the same time and come out with a degree in theater, which sounded great. And that's where I started to think, well, I would kind of like that. Because in my senior year, I had applied to Georgetown for the Foreign Service, and they didn't want me. So I figured, well, maybe I'm stupid, or maybe I wasn't groomed for this, not knowing, of course, that Georgetown raises all the Foreign Service officers to a large extent. If you didn't have family connections, that's how you would. But they didn't want a good guy from Santa Clara and all that way out west. So, but as I said, I was thinking, well, that was a great disappointment. And meanwhile, my mother was working on me and got all her Jesuit friends working on me to, you don't want to go in the Foreign Service, and you don't even want to go on to graduate school. What you want to do is you want to earn a lot of money. You want to be an attorney, you wanted to be a surgeon, and I couldn't see myself there because I had no head for chemistry or mathematics, all that scientific stuff the doctors did. So I finally, just settled on Santa Clara with a master's degree and finishing that up. And then my point at the end of graduate school was, hey, I'll go on to big time stuff. I'll go to Berkeley and I'll get my doctorate in dramatic art. They got a heck of a program up there. So that's what I did. I applied, I was accepted, and that's when the draft caught me. And so prior to that, though, and that was 67 when I was finished with my master's and just ready to head out to Berkeley. By 67, the Vietnam conflict was really getting really stinking, and there were protests all over. And then as I became more politically aware as a graduate student, I joined the protests, and so it came as no great surprise that the draft eventually would enter my horizons, which it did. And it was peculiar because the friends I'd graduated with from, the university there, they all were left alone by the draft. But for some reason, they wouldn't let me alone. I think it was a lot because of my radical activity. I was involved in protest marches there at the university and stuff like that. So anyhow, I waited and tried to get free of it for a year and argued with them, but that was no good. Finally, I was faced with prison or the military. So I said, okay, time to, go along with the United States Army. So I did. That's how I got in there. There was additional radicalization, radical activities after the Vietnam experience, but that's how I was sort of prepared. I entered the military then in 1968, late 67, 68, really critical of what the military was doing, and So although I took the basic training and I learned a lot of skills there, at the same time I didn't really want to be gung-ho and participate. At that point, my mother would say, "Oh, you want to be an officer? Of course you do. You've got this college education. You're perfect officer material." But I didn't want to go for that. It would have been extra time on my part, and it would have meant taking a lot of responsibility for stuff that I thought was really pretty questionable, because I had heard a lot of the horror stories coming out and all this, and I don't know that I would want to assume a leadership position once I got in the military. So I went in as a private E1, lowest on the totem pole, and that's where I started my basic training in late '67, early '68.
Where was the basic training and what was your early experience like? And then walk us through getting there.
Oh, it was awful. It was up in Fort Lewis, Washington. So after, the usual drop your shorts and bend over, get your medical stuff in Oakland, they shipped me up to Washington. And there I was at Fort Lewis, and it was winter, which was the worst time up in Washington to go through basic training, because it was cold, it was rainy, and sometimes you get snow. So I had my 8 weeks of basic training, another 8 weeks of advanced infantry training, and we would be, crawling through the mud and the rain and camping out in the woods up there, freezing, and meanwhile learning a lot of the military skills, how to handle all the weapons, learning the military history, code of justice, and doing all the stuff that people do in boot camp, where you peel potatoes for a while, you handle the garbage truck, you do all kinds of different things, wax the floors of where you're living and make sure your boots are spit shined and all of that. And it wasn't bad, but it was just, I didn't mind the physical training. It's pretty rigorous, but it was something very new, because I had never closely associated with a lot of the people that were being drafted at that time. And, I come from an upper middle class family. I had all this elitist education, for gosh sakes. And suddenly there I was living around a group of folks who, for the most part, I'd say 80% of them never been to college, seen the inside of a classroom. And secondly, they came from all over the country. We had hillbillies there. We had people from Florida, space cadets, California kids. There was, way up in the boonies of the Dakotas and all. And they were all young, In fact, I was the oldest one there. By the time I reached Vietnam, I was like, the draft got me at 25 years old. So I was almost out of it. But like I say, they didn't want to let me go, I guess. Anyhow, there I was. So I was older than these 18-year-olds, by about 7 years. And so, I made friends there, but, I wasn't part of the nonsense that 18 and 19-year-olds always go through and all that sort of stuff. So it was kind of alienating in that sense, socially. But at the same time, the Fort Lewis is like any other Army camp. It's all nicely manicured. It's sort of like middle-class America with little roads, etc. And, of course, you do things like marching all over the place and running and all that stuff. But up until I left for Vietnam, it was a normal part of American life, I would say, except that it was uniquely devoted to training for military, etc.
So while you were during basic training, did you have very much outside access to the radio, television?
All the time. We had plenty of that, yeah.
So you knew things were really getting bad.
Things were heating up, and I thought, well, I don't have much control of where I'm going. It was up to the gods of somewhere, the War Department maybe, or where they'd sent me. And I knew we had bases overseas. Like I said, I'd spent a year in Italy. I knew we had air bases in Italy. The fleet had come in and party down in Naples, all over Germany, and all Europe was still a lot of American military bases. On the other hand, there was Asia, which was getting to be a shooting war and getting much, much worse. So I didn't know where, and you don't have any control over that. Yeah.
So when did you find out you're going somewheres?
Well, at the end of basic training, you get your marching orders, and mine said, okay, you're going to go to Asia now. And even then I thought, okay, well, this jungle is it? I thought, Asia, I'd never been to Asia, no. The only thing I knew about Asia was some of the war movies from World War II, like, I guess there's a lot of jungle over there. I don't know, that certainly wasn't desert, it certainly wasn't any cities. You see movies about Europe and World War II and stuff like that, but
It certainly wasn't like you're training in Washington either.
like what?
You're training in Washington in the snow and the woods and all that.
No, the weather was a big shocker when I got there. So, okay, over I went, and again, I didn't have much choice, so.
Well, where did you end up going?
Where did I end up going? They flew me to Saigon. They flew me the air base. There was Bien Hoa, the big air base. And from there, they put me in country training, as they called it, for a couple weeks. So you got used to what to do about finding cobras in the jungle and keeping wounds clean. You cut yourself with a knife or something, and all the special equipment you had to know. And then they assigned me to an infantry unit that was working out of Bien Hoa. And of course, we have a big air base there. And that's the flatlands of Vietnam. And we go out in the boonies and just largely secure all the area around. There were no big campaigns at that time in the southern part of the country. I got there at a time called Hamburger Hill, which was taking place at another location in country. And the horror stories coming out of there were pretty bad. They've even made films of that sort of thing. But when I got in, it was at the peak and starting to wind up. So I never got assigned to that, fortunately. Because new people who come in and get thrown right into a meat grinder like that are the ones that were likely to be first killed. It's the people who knew what to do, who'd been there a while, were the ones who kind of tended to survive it. So fortunately, well, that was going on, but fortunately I didn't have to be part of that. And I stayed in the southern area of Bien Hoa for about 2 to 3 months as an infantryman, light weapons infantryman, they called me. So that's what I did. We'd just go out on foot patrols. And then we'd come back. And it was mostly just boring. You spend most of your time sitting around waiting for something to happen. And in between the times you're out in the field and not working something in the base camp, cleaning weapons, filling sandbags, all kinds of stuff, you were sitting around reading books, listening to the radio or the Armed Forces Network. Good morning, Vietnam. They always had that going
Did
on.
you actually hear him? Did you hear him?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah.
And we never got any stateside programs, though, radio or TV. Oh, they'd show the movies outside. We'd get those somewhat late. And, of course, the music coming in was always current. So we had the Beatles and the Stones and Country Joe and the Fish and all that, And we'd be sleeping in hooches, as they called them, or in my case, bunkers a lot of the time. Kind of cut off from things. But it wasn't bad because one thing the Army learned was that you wanted to keep up morale, you fed people pretty regularly. You gave them enough downtime and you'd provide them with showers so you wouldn't be living out in the field all the time. You'd come back to a base camp and Corps of Engineers would try to build up the base camps with a certain amount of civilized infrastructure. You had showers there. Occasionally you'd have a mess hall, but at least one hot meal a day, that sort of thing. And that's when I would say one of the shockers, not just the locale, but was the army that was in Vietnam. I mentioned that when we were in up around Seattle and Fort Lewis, I was exposed to a whole group of people I'd never been around before. When I got over to Vietnam, I was exposed to even more diverse group, and that's where I encountered people with hardly any education whatsoever. At that time, as you probably know, they were dragging and the real bottom feeders of our society as much as possible. So whose number would come up? Well, it was the people of color, the kids off the street, and a lot of people who had been in trouble with the law, which was serve time or head over to Vietnam. And that was interesting because our top sergeant of my unit, it was said that he was either going to life in prison from Louisiana or join the Army and become a top sergeant. And of course, he chose to become a top sergeant. Who wouldn't? So that was a whole bunch of strange people, as well as a few people like me who'd come through the system somehow, got snagged up in that, more or less educated, and, but it was quite a contrast. It was a real challenge because you had to merge, blend with those people if you were going to be a military unit. And I realized that pretty well because, you had to rely on the person next to you, behind you, when things got difficult. But it was hard. It wasn't easy. And of course, I was always kind of suspect because I was one of those elitist kids. What are you doing here? That sort of thing. But hey, I was serving my time and counting my days just as much as the guy next to me, So.
What were some of the incidents that caused you to realize that these guys maybe had come from backgrounds that were, well, obviously not different than yours, but some of these people may have been dangerous, huh?
Yeah, very dangerous. Well, soon as I got there, the first incident, if you want, was the notion of looking out around where our base area was, and all the time seeing about 30 or 40 people standing over there by the field, and they're all pretty well fully armed. You carry your weapon everywhere, and they were mostly people of color. And I would ask, well, what are they all doing out there? And they were all smoking dope. It was opium or marijuana, and the MPs wouldn't touch them. I mean, you had people there who were, I would wander over once in a while and see what's going on, have a smoke myself, and some of these guys were like really very strange guys. And like I say, they were all armed to the teeth, so the MPs would never touch them. Just if they want to go out in the field and get high, okay, let them do that. And if they cause any more trouble, we'll get them. But when there's 30 or 40 of them, you're not going to send a bunch of MPs into stuff. So that was the first thing. And like I say, some of those guys were looking really heavy. We would also come into contact with a lot of veterans who'd been there in the field, and they'd come back too. And they didn't have much respect for anything. They would wear their uniforms because, you have to wear camo in the jungle. You don't, so you wouldn't be seen very much. But they were pretty rancid, pretty raggedy. Half the time they wouldn't even salute because they'd been out there, and they'd come back, and they'd just be back long enough to get some hot chow, relax, and then they'd go out, and they knew what they were going to. We hadn't really done that. These were the guys who they would airlift out there. They'd go on helicopters, and they'd go way behind. We'd only go out maybe 5-6 miles around the immediate Bien Hoa area. These guys would go 20, 30, 40 miles and be part of an assault force. And so they would see a heck of a lot more action than we did. For the first 2 or 3 months I was there in that role of infantry. And those guys had a lot of horror stories that you couldn't believe, but obviously they were true, so you came around to believe them.
Give me an example.
Well, there were stories of biggest horror story was a horror story that depicted your position being overrun by the enemy. At which point you began to realize that, yeah, those things happened. And when your position got overrun, then it was every man for himself, and usually this would occur at night. And it was hand to hand, and it was not fun at all. And at times, you heard that a situation got so bad with the position, they would call in airstrikes, their own airstrikes on the position and wipe everybody out. And so I was, you'd say, okay, God help me ever getting into that situation again. So that was one kind of thing. The other horror story was stories of some of these guys who'd been out there, longer than we had, since we were relatively new in country. They would report doing things to civilians. I mean, sometimes they had to burn entire villages that were, say, sympathetic to the Viet Cong. There was no way you could separate the people out. You just took them out, throw them in a stockade somewhere, and burn the whole village. And they would talk about, some of them, quite honestly, I thought were psychopaths. They would talk about torturing people to get information and stuff like that. Obviously I had never any experience with that, and never any experience with civilian atrocities or what we now call collateral damage. Well, we had to bomb this thing, and geez, we took out a school too, or a hospital or whatever. That had never been part of my universe as a civilian growing up in the States. I mean, that Hollywood never had any of that stuff shown, and so my notion of the good and pure and noble and all that aspect to the American military started to get very tarnished as I met these guys and they started talking about what went down out there. And but they did sober us up a lot. Not so much to say, well, we're going to be sloppy and lack discipline ourselves, and but rather, these guys. One of the things that struck me was these guys had weapons all over them. They'd have 2 or 3 combat knives. They'd have pistols. They'd have your standard issue assault rifle, but they'd also have shotguns and all kinds of things, and 40 pounds of grenades and different kinds of things strapped to their body. I'm thinking, well, okay, so that gradually as I went out more and more patrols, I'd take more of that stuff with me because you never knew what would happen, and we'd go walking through these villages where there were people all the time, and you never know who was inside. You didn't ever search every grass shack or whatever where these people lived. More commonly, we'd be walking along in the open because around by Bien Hoa, it's all flat. It's mostly a lot of rice paddy. And so you'd be walking along rice paddies and what they call little berms that divided up the paddies into square plots. And there'd be people working out there, but you'd heard the stories, as soon as you pass by these simple, harmless peasants who'd smile and wave at you, women and men. You go by, and then they'd reach into the mud and pull out their assault rifle in a plastic bag and attack you from behind. So you never do. So I guess I just got a lot more wary, a lot more suspicious the more we went on patrol. But at that time, this was getting to be about 1968, 69. I'd say the enemy were pretty cautious. They limited, at least around where I was, they limited their attacks to night. So there were times when we would have to go out on night perimeter guard, and that continued after I got shifted out of a combat role. We went out looking for trouble to assignment within the administrative corps, still with the infantry, but now I was in charge of I was put in charge of about 4 or 5 other clerks who were devoted to reporting. And that was another eye-opener. I thought before that happened, well, God help me, I hope the bullet hasn't been made with my name on it, because a lot was up to chance. I mean, I could dodge and duck like anybody else, but you never knew. So I wondered if I would actually make it through 12 months. But then orders came down for me one day, and sergeant said, "Yeah, oh, you're leaving here. Get your kit, take it, get back to new place." I said, "What for? What am I doing?" He says, "Well, you lucked out. You're going to be administrative in the Headquarters Battalion." I said, "Okay." So I went, and that's when I realized that the perception of the war was a lot more important to the movers and shakers than the actual conduct of the war. Because my job was what they call a morning report section. And in the morning report section, the military got a morning report of every unit that they had in country. And that would show the number of people in your unit, the number of killed, the number of wounded, missing in action, so they could get the numbers right. And they did this every day, and we in the morning report section, we'd type these up, no more than 3 clerical errors to every form, and we had to get that information back down to Saigon, to what's called MAC 5 headquarters, by 4 every afternoon, so that that could be telexed back to Arlington. And so every day they had an accurate report of how many men in the field, and if they had too many, they'd move an aircraft carrier out of the war zone and say, "Our numbers are down today," and they'd sail it back in or whatever. So they knew who was wounded, who was not, what the strength of a field unit, et cetera, and generally what was happening. So that's what I was assigned to do for about another 10, 11 months, and I was grateful for that. They kept me at Bien Hoa for another 4 or 5 months, and then they moved me up closer to the DMZ in a place called Phu Bai, which was right by the DMZ. But that's what I did. They were happy to have me because I had I guess you'd say, a flair for paperwork. I had a master's degree in English literature, for God's sake. But more than that, I was a little bit older, obviously, 25, 26, and I could supervise. I had some leadership there. They put me in charge of 3 or 4 other clerks, young guys who also could type, right, and could take instruction, and, that was so. I guess you'd say I ascended to a more cultivated, certainly more educated class of people with job skill sets than, the ones out in the field, eating cockroaches and everything, surviving and killing as many people as you can. So that's what I did, and that freed me up for doing a lot of other things. Although, at night, we always had to pull guard duty, and we were assaulted. Charlie would be out there, and he'd try and get through your perimeter, because we had helicopters there. It was a full base. My particular section was in the adjutant general's, we were doing reports, but we were a huge base, and there was a lot of firepower constant. So Charlie'd be coming, and so we'd have to do perimeter stuff at night, which was the creepiest thing, because I never was much for nights. I always tended to get disoriented. Even in Washington in basic training, they'd have us out on night maneuvers. And things like, okay, we're going to turn you loose now, and let's see how long it takes you to find your way back. Here's a compass. God, I would be lost in the Washington woods for God knows how long, So anyway, I was no friend of nights. I'd been out camping. That's nothing, But now it was nights, and there's people coming at you. Now, that's a whole different thing. So it was quite a challenge at night. In the daytime, things started to get more civilized because, I had my duties. I had, the stuff to take care of. But usually we could knock out those morning reports by 1 o'clock or so. And the rest of the day was all downtime. So I started developing other stuff. I'd get some passes to go into Saigon. I would go out. I would teach orphans at one of the villages near the base, outside the wire. I took up photography and took a lot of photographs and learned how to use a dark room. And so I had a lot of downtime, and I wrote a lot there too. Of course, at night you put it all down and you smeared your face with camouflage and got all your ammo that you could carry, and out you went. Sometimes you'd be out around the perimeter within a mile, usually. Other times, most of the times, we were in bunkered, fortified positions waiting for bad guys to come through the wire, Anything outside the wire, that was Indian country.
Did you have any interactions with bad guys?
Oh, yes. We were assaulted several times, and so there was that. They never got really close, fortunately. I mean, this was a big base, so as soon as any trouble started, you always had 3 or 4 helicopters in the air. And you always had all kinds of tons of artillery support wherever anything was happening. But nonetheless, they'd come, especially the worst thing you always were afraid of was the 1 or 2 sneaking through, the guerrillas you'd call them. They were called sappers at the time. And their main mission was to take about a 30 or 40-pound bag of explosives with them and spend 3 or 4 hours wiggling through the barbed wire, getting past the bunkers where the patrols were and finding your ammo dumps and your helicopters and blowing those up and that sort of thing. So we were out there, watching for that every night. Even when it sounded pretty peaceful, you knew there were bad guys out there. And it was hard to tell because you had, mongoose out there running around. You had water buffalo parading. Half the time people had opened fire on water buffaloes, and by the time the flares had come down from artillery, you'd say, oh, another water buffalo. Okay, better than Victor Charlie or something, so. And there were times when there were ground assaults and we would have to, we were taking fire and we were giving fire back. But we always stopped them in the concertina wire somehow with one type of weapon or another. But the longer I stayed there, by the time I got out in the 70s, it was winding down on big assaults on bases, and the Viet Cong and the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, they were concentrating their assaults in different ways. There were always, those individual assassins wandering around. You go to Saigon, for example, there were always those VC on motorbikes coming around with pistols, find some GIs, shoot them up and roar off, But in terms of where I was stationed at the base, we never had any big, massive assaults by the time I got out of there. It was 1970, early 1970. In fact, it was all right because after finishing 12 months, they said, look, you want to stay on for a couple more months, then we'll release you completely when you got out. Otherwise, you'll have to go to Army Reserve meetings back in the States for 2 or 3 years because, they wanted to keep you in country and get more work out of you. So I ended up spending 14 and a half months there instead of a 12-month tour. And when I was done, I was done. No more duties to do, just benefits from military service, and glad to get out.
So, try to give us an idea of what it felt like on the day that you knew you were leaving finally.
The day I was leaving, they would get you out of the base, whatever you were doing, about a week before to process you. You'd have to turn in your equipment. You have to get your health check. You'd have to, get uniforms or whatever, get all your paperwork. Oh, there's always a lot of paperwork done. And they'd ship you to a holding place by the airfield. And at any one time, there are about 500 or 1,000 guys just waiting for their plane. So that was your date of estimated return from overseas service. When the plane became available, you were told. So you were hanging out doing nothing for a week. It was probably the most boring time I spent there, just waiting for that airplane to
Did you
get
talk to the
scheduled.
other guys that were leaving?
I did. I don't know what
Anything
there
you
was.
remember?
Nothing special. Each of them were
Let's
damn
get
glad
the
to
hell
get
out of
out.
here.
Yeah, I mean, sure, yeah. And all the way along, even before that time, probably the commonest subject of conversation was how much time you got left. You know, and you could be either a long time, you know, or you could be short time. And it's a real short time too. But the shorter time you had left in country, the more nervous you got. You were hoping, oh, I hope they don't put me on this patrol, or oh, I hope I never go there again, you know. And then, oh boy, 'cause you didn't want to get shot in your last week or last 2 weeks in country. That was awful, you know. But there was no particular subject of conversation about getting out on the day you got out. Except the talk was, well, what are you going to do as soon as you get back? And what about girlfriends, right? Like, whatever. Oh, well, she's no longer around, you know, or I'm getting back to a girlfriend, and they'd show you pictures, and get back to the world, you know. No one ever knew what it would actually be like to get back to the world, and that was another shocker once it happened. But there was all the fantasy of, oh, I'm going back home. I'll see my family. I'll get back to my old job. Well, I'll just find another girlfriend. Oh, boy, when I see her, I'll go up one side and down the other for running around with my friends, you know, or whatever, you know. Just the thoughts already were in kind of trying to envision what it would be like when I finally stepped back. And as for me, I already had a plan of action because I was, like I said, I was accepted to graduate school just at the time they drafted me. And I told the grad school, I told Berkeley, you know, hey, you know, Uncle Sam wants me. Can you put me on ice for a year and a half or whatever? And they said, sure. So I knew I was going back. I would start the program at Berkeley in the fall, and I had got out in, I think it was May or June. So you know, my path was pretty well defined. I had been married when I went in, you know, which is another fun subject of conversation. So I was going back to my wife. I'd seen her once on R&R. And I was going back to a place I knew, and a program, the next couple of years of grad school. I was back to the world again. I'd finally made it. So in my case, yeah. But at the same time, it wasn't anything you could talk about because, like I say, most of the enlisted men at that time, they weren't from my background, from my educational level or stuff. So I wasn't, you know, making a whole lot of friends, drinking buddies or anything like that. So, yeah.
So what was the process of getting out?
Not much. They flew you back. I think it was a Flying Tigers. And the liquor flowed on the plane. The stewardesses were more than happy to, you know, cheer us up any way they could. They landed. You got to choose where you wanted to go. Now, most of the time, if you didn't choose, you'd go fly back and land at the same place that you flew out of the year before. So I went and chose to, you know, fly back to Chicago because that's where my wife was living. So they dumped me in Chicago. That's fine. And then we got together and we went out west again to where I was going to go to school and see my family and all that good stuff. But there was about, I would say, no more than 3 or 4 days of processing. They just made sure your final papers were in order. You got your, you know, your veteran's card and, you know, all that stuff. And then you were given a bit of parting cash and a bus ticket or something, I guess, and away you went. And then that was it.
Was there any reaction, because you hear stories about soldiers coming back from Vietnam to
Well, yeah, that was a big one. That was a big shock. And I don't think any of the guys I was with over there anticipated the disillusionment that would befall them when they got off. Because when I got off the plane, there were protesters outside the airport, and that was 1970, and by then people were really getting violent and war protests all over the country. So when these planes came back full of the veterans from the campaigns, all those airports, there were people picketing, they're making fun of them, shouting nasty stuff, and there we were. I'd come back with, even still, I had these notions in my head about, World War II, when they had ticker tape parades for the veterans, all that celebratory, the victorious army's return. I had not heard stories. I guess somehow the military kept it from us. I don't know, but I wasn't expecting all those people, to be out there calling us murderers and all the rest. And and some of the guys I was with, naturally, they didn't care, and they thought the protesters were wimps. Others, okay, I'm just going back to be a normal person again, man. In my face, why? But there was a lot of that, yeah. And it was a lot of disillusionment among the veterans who came back, that they were greeted in such a way. And I guess a lot's been made of that since. There's been a lot written about that.
So, but once you got out of your uniform, they wouldn't know you from...
No, they wouldn't, no.
Yeah.
Especially after your hair grew back, yeah.
So you're on your way to Berkeley now with your wife, and you arrive in Berkeley, and what was Berkeley like in 1970?
Well, that was a cauldron of insurrection, you might say. And especially with there were some anti-war plays that they were staging also, and every week there was protests, and so it was like being suddenly immersed in the counterculture and the protest culture. And I confess, you might say, I fell a victim to it. I felt very sympathetic to it. I participated. And the main thing I wanted to do was, do theater and do that. But at the same time, I was, because I was a veteran and I was going to school on the GI Bill, there was I had a kind of a foot in both camps. Not that I was sympathetic to the war, but just that I felt really different from a lot of the protests. Most of them had no military experience. And whenever there was a protest rally or a march or something in San Francisco or Oakland or wherever, I'd be looking around for the grizzled guys. And they were always guys. I don't think there were any grizzled gals at that time. I guess there are now, but back at that time, there were no... there were no women in combat. They were all nurses.
They couldn't draft them.
No, but there were volunteers over there, the gals, and they were in nursing for the most part. So I'd be looking at in the ranks of all the protesters. There'd be families, as well as a lot of younger people, mostly younger people. But I'd be looking for the grizzled guys who looked like almost like Hell's Angels, but you could tell they were veterans because they'd be wearing parts of their uniforms, like a camo hat or a uniform with the sleeves cut off, and that sort of thing. And just to see where they were coming from. So I didn't feel kind of alone being a veteran, but also in the protest march. There were a number of them, veterans who were just really unhappy with it and looking to participate in that.
How did they react to you being a veteran?
No problem. They were veterans themselves. As long as you were in the march, you were one of them, I guess as a veteran, I was a little more experienced, a little more savvy about what would happen when you were in a march, because that was the time when Ronald Reagan was governor of California.
Yep.
And he was not hesitant at all to just send in National Guard at us and tear gas and all the rest, the sheriff's cars with tear gas. And so, when I could see that coming, I knew I would want to separate myself from where the action was, which something probably that I learned over in Vietnam. So I didn't get beat up or walloped or tossed in jail like a lot of the others did. So.
What was your attitude that here you are, you didn't want to go there to begin with, you realized that you had come to realize that you really didn't know why we were there, and then you finally come home, and then you have somebody like the governor, Reagan, basically saying that you're a horrible person and you should be proud to go out and do these. What was your attitude towards the government, so to speak, who was sending you there, and then when you came back, this is what they were treating you, this is how they were treating you?
Well, at first, I knew very much why we were there. As soon as I got drafted, I was thinking, I started to learn all the different reasons why this might be so. You know, there was the old domino theory of, well, we can't let Vietnam fall. There was the patriotism theory. We're doing this because we never lost a war. And then by the time I got out, that all seemed pretty hollow, and I was beginning to realize how crass it was. Like, for example, when I was over in Vietnam, I noticed there was pretty much one or only two construction companies with contracts to do all the building and the heavy lifting and all. And I'm thinking, well, why would just those construction companies get into this? And then I started asking, well, who's delivering all this oil? It took fantastic amounts of oil, gasoline, aviation fuel to run that sort of thing. And I'm thinking, that's probably getting to be expensive. And of course, while I was over there, the notion was if you could, drop a $5,000 bomb on somebody, that's better than losing any life, because you didn't want to lose lives. That always looked bad. And so the amount of ammunition and ordnance that was, blown up, just that got to be, I got to realize that was a heck of a lot of money too. And so I started to get more and more cynical about the economic underpinnings of the war and wondering who was benefiting by it. By the time I got back, I started looking more into that, and of course, lots been done on that too. So when I did get back, and there was all this protests going on and all, I understood that whoever we were protesting, we were going against the mainstream, and we were going against a really big mainstream, and stopping the war was not very easy. It took a number of years. So, but I knew marches counted, and I had no trouble benefiting from a lot of that. As a veteran, like I said, I got the GI Bill benefits. That's fine. I thought, hey, I'd earned it, nothing else. So I wouldn't say I was conflicted. I realized that I had participated in something because I had to. And now I had a choice that I could join in opposition with what looked to be millions of others, and not just in the United States, right? So I knew this was a domestic conflict, but I didn't feel much personal conflict of that. I was just somebody from a different walk of life, like a veteran who was protesting the veteran service, and someone else. Because a lot of people, as I said, in these protest marches were older. They were families. They may have had military service themselves and felt that the military had been betrayed and it was doing terrible things now, and that's why they were in the protest. So in any case, I was pretty much surrounded by fellow radicals like myself, so I didn't worry too much about that,
As the war wound down, especially as the end of it was just a mess, did you have any thoughts about, I remember seeing huge aircraft carriers where they were just throwing helicopters off the side into the water. Mm-hmm. And of course, the fall of Saigon, my father was actually, as part of the United Nations effort, he was out in that area. And we knew people who were actually walking up those stairs to get into the helicopter. What do those images do for you in particular? Or did they have any effect at all?
By that time, they had no effect. That was about 73. And I understood everything that was happening. Getting those people, the last ones out of Saigon, there was a big to-do about that, the helicopters landing on the embassy roof, the thousands of Vietnamese trying to grab on and get liberated. I understood where that was coming from. The Viet Cong were not a bunch of nice people. They weren't going to be very fair when they took over. You knew there was going to be a lot of bloodletting, and people were just running for their lives wherever they could, including trying to get into the American helicopters and other airplanes. That didn't surprise me. The stuff of pushing airplanes off aircraft carriers, well, I understood that. They, whatever could make the flight out of Saigon or wherever and get on an aircraft carrier, most of them helicopters. There were just too many of them. You had to get rid of them, throw them over the side. And that was part of the overall waste, which is something I began to see when I was over there. Like I said, we were blowing off a lot of ammunition. Any military base over there, it was incredible the amount of junk and garbage that had amassed by the time I got to see it. The war was going on 5, 6, 7 years. And there were barrels of Agent Orange that had been left there years ago leaking into the ground. There was all kinds of shipping containers, those things, trash heaps, immense stuff. And equipment, busted down equipment. Trucks, tanks, you name it, armored personnel carriers, not to mention the weaponry around, and you weren't going to take that with you, especially at the end, because everything came all at once at the end, relatively speaking. It wasn't like you can go in Kuwait and say, okay, we're going to gently wind down and get some of this stuff back. And no, we had to run from the enemy coming right into Saigon and overrunning anything. And we just left a lot of it.
Paid for by the tax dollars.
Oh, hell
Guess
yes.
who made the money? That's
Well,
that's the thing.
yeah, it was the war material contractors,
Yeah.
right? The same way it is now.
Yeah.
But it was true, we left a lot of it behind. And on our way out, and I was part of this too, there were some things they knew they weren't going to leave and they weren't going to take with us. So we just spiked them. We just, burned them up, blew them up, burned them, whatever. But when the very end came, it was just throw everything in the South China Sea, push it over, burn this down, explode everything. I could understand that. Yeah, a tremendous waste, not just of treasure, but of blood. That was even a worse thing. You were shocked by the amount of dollars that had gone, by the way. But you stop to think of the number of people killed. That was a lot of American lives, not to mention it was 3 or 4 times that amount of locals, I guess more or less civilians. There was that wasted, And on top of that were those who weren't killed outright, who were suffering those war injuries. It's like we have body counts of, who's dead in Afghanistan this week, But we never are aware of thousands of people who've lost their limbs, who are just completely, screwed up from combat, from our wars in the Mideast now. It was the same way then. You had something like 50,000 servicemen, who were killed, but you probably had up to 3/4 or a whole million of them who were suffering injuries, and many of them still suffering, now. The wounded and the cared for, without a great Veterans Administration to take care of them. So.
Yeah, that's part of the project I'm involved with now is the aftermath of not just here, but also Vietnam.
Well, I had seen the waste. A lot of people know the numbers, but when you see the waste, it's something else. And it's just something you learn to live with. Hey, I had a 49 Ford I used to love to drive around, but it got rusted out and I had to go. And anyway, there was nothing you could do about it, Sure, shove the plane off in the sea, that's it.
About about a year ago, I have AAA, and so, for my car.
Right, sure.
My car. And I get a AAA magazine.
Okay.
And although I didn't have to go to Vietnam, I think you and I have talked about this, I came that close. I mean,
Yeah.
I went in 72 to the draft board and was told, go home, kid, it's all over with. I mean, I was one of the lucky ones. My birthday just happened to coincide with that thing you're talking about. But I have to admit that when I got this magazine in the mail, it had a profound impact on me, and I'm sure it would have a bigger impact on somebody who was there. But the cover of this AAA magazine was the joys of going to Saigon. This magazine.
When? After the war, you mean?
I'm talking about a year ago. A year ago, in the mail.
2016?
I get a
Oh!
front cover of the AAA magazine, which has.
Really post-war.
There's obviously, the joys of Paris one month. Right? Another month is, go to this. And this one was literally devoted to why you should go to Vietnam. And it had a profound effect on me because I looked at that and I thought, all those lives, and even the homeless people still wandering around. And now, after all these years, I can pay a couple $1,000, get on an airplane, and go there. So what was the point of doing all that to begin with? I guess was my reaction.
Well, you want an answer? There's no answer. I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah.
If history is a river, Frank, there's a hell of a lot of blood gone under that bridge and it just flows away. But at the same time, you and I both know there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the Vietnam experience or the Desert Storm experience or a lot of experiences. They're still making war movies of World War II. Yeah. And they will continue to do so about Vietnam and Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and the rest of it. War is a seductive and fascinating subject.
But the thing that bothers me, Roger, is, and I think your description of this river of blood is the ones sitting on the side of that never had to experience that are making the money out of that blood. They're sitting back in their mansions and traveling in their private jets because they're the ones selling the airplanes and selling the bombs and selling the materials, the chemicals that go into those bombs. They watch that river of blood go by and it just doesn't seem to affect them at all.
You don't want to waste your time in finger pointing. I mean, you might point your finger at that arms broker if you want, but you might also point your finger at the guys who'd go and torture civilians for the hell of it because they knew they could get away from it. And so who's responsible for that? One thing I realize is that the war never made monsters of anybody. The war just allowed people to come out. Whatever was in them, it would go to the surface. If you were a good person to begin with, you could remain a good person. You might even have some good influence. I don't know. Maybe I did some good with all these Vietnamese kids that I was teaching there at the orphanage. What a trip that was. I don't know, but it gave me the opportunity to do that. And I think even the most violent and depraved people, they had that in their nature before they came. It just, a lot of these young people, 18, 19-year-old, were, like I said, some were psychopathic, others were just completely amoral. And you get a person like that and give them an assault weapon, and there's no law around them. They'll do their job, and they'll do more if they get a chance. And you're going to point a finger at the war for doing that, or you're going to point a finger at them or the person who made that rifle, or there's enough guilt to go around if you want to do that. Yeah. Somehow you learn to live with that.
I think we'd stop there, except I have one other question. This is the big difference between, not difference, but there's something that you said to me that just really struck me. My Eagle Scout project, and you know what an Eagle Scout project
Oh, yeah.
is, for you to get your Eagle Scout, was raising funds for an orphanage in Taipei. But all I had to do was gather together a bunch of stuff, sell it, and then be able to donate it to the orphanage. And I felt very good about it, and that's what got me my Eagle medal Tell me about your experience with the orphanage in Vietnam.
This was about 3 miles outside the base, outside the wire, Indian country. It was all girls. It was like, I'd say, 11, 12 years old up to maybe 15, 16. It was a hangover from French days. The French had long been gone, and now the Yanks kind of protected it, but you never knew out there. None of them spoke English, but the top sergeant, the guy who was, from Louisiana and decided to he got the request for somebody to help the orphanage out, and his staff noticed I had French in my background. So he said to me, listen, why don't you go out, and they need a teacher there. They want to learn English. I said, well, okay. So he gave me a driver and a Jeep, and 3 days a week I'd go out to this orphanage. And it was a really unusual experience trying to teach English with someone only with schoolboy French. And I'd have an assault rifle with me at all times in the classroom. I'd be lucky if I could find some chalk out there, and we could do this. And so I did that for about 3 or 4 months, and those kids were great, but they didn't have anything. I remember once I got a trip organized. I don't know why top sergeant let me do it, but he said, okay, I'll give you an effing bus, So I put all those kids on a bus, and we went to Saigon to the zoo. Oh, they'd never seen Saigon. They'd never seen a zoo. We spent the day at the Saigon Zoo, and it was run by some nuns. I don't know what order they were, but they came along as, chaperones to get the kids around. God, they had ice cream. Oh, look, there's an effluent, all this stuff. So that was fun too. But I was just teaching them out there 3 afternoons a week out in that orphanage until the VCO veranda. I didn't see it, but I understood. We had to stop going out there because the place had been blown up. A lot of the girls were shot up. Orphans were killed. And so end of teaching at the orphanage. But although I still have photographs of a lot of those young kids, and hanging around it. I didn't mind that because, I had been like a teaching assistant before I went in. I'd probably, by that time, the time I got out of the Army, I'd end up being a teacher, as I have been. So teaching is teaching. The way I went, it was kind of unusual trying to teach English. Jacques through le bas, with a machine gun over your shoulder all the time you're teaching them. They were very nice. They'd bring me in and give me tea afterwards, and then we'd drive in the Jeep back. I never knew when the road would blow up from a mine under us. Fortunately, it never did. But for 3 months, that was really, I've never forgotten that. That's a great experience. But I don't know what eventual good it did and how many of those kids are still alive, whatever happened to them. So it's one of those things you do because it's nice to do, and you can't follow the impact of it down the years. You just hope and pray something remains.
It's a question, Roger, I ask every veteran at the end. How do you look back on your experience in the military, not just necessarily Vietnam per se, but just how do you look back on your experience in the military?
Well, I think there's several things there, Frank. I'm glad I had it overall. At the time, I wasn't. I just said, I don't want to be here. Oh, anti-war, this. But I'm glad I had it because I feel now like I was part of a great historical incident. Being part of history, however insignificant. I wasn't a general or an officer or anything like that, but I was up close and personal with what that whole thing was. And I've come to realize how unique it was, because not only do many people not know about it at all, it's impossible to talk about it with people who've never been in that situation. Nobody asks me as though they're kind of afraid. I guess I've heard this is pretty common. Nobody really asks veterans what it was like, and veterans are not always talking about it, very reluctant to. But it was unique, and I learned a lot about things, about life, about other people, about my own limitations and self-preservation and self-confidence, whatever you want to call that, and also about, you want to get academic about it, the military-industrial complex and that sort of thing. So that today, I think it's given me a perspective on that same kind of situation, which hasn't changed. I mean, there's still, we've got conflicts, we've got the glorification of the military, and now our present president is beefing up the defense for more involvement. It's made me cynical about that. Questionable. I think there are times really when we're grateful we have some military ability, but I'm really deeply suspicious of the uses to which it's put by people, particularly the people you mentioned, the weapons dealers and weapons merchants, as well as investors and others, none of whom have had any experience with war. I would suggest, too, most of them have probably never had sons or daughters, and so they stand at a remove from it. They promote it. They talk a bit abstractly. It becomes another political strategy they could use without realizing the terrible cost and human suffering that it's going to involve, because their eyes are fixed on the tremendous profit that can emerge. I mean, look at Vietnam. What we did there, say, in just one place like Cam Ranh Bay, was to create a huge deep water port for a vast amount of shipping that had to come in there to support the war effort during the Vietnam years. We pulled out, and we left Vietnam with that huge asset, and they are, they're still using it to this day, airfields and everything else. And my son, who's a businessman, he goes over to Vietnam and Asia frequently, and he's been to Vietnam, and he likes it. Saigon is starting to be very vital again, and of course it's a lot more modernized. I'm sure I wouldn't recognize a lot of it 40 years later. When I was there, it was still old France. It was still very French, But yeah, there's that. I have a perspective on it, that I can use as a filter to see what's going on today. I certainly also, a third thing was I certainly enjoyed the benefits. I used the veterans' benefits, as I say, for school and education. I used them for buying my house, so there's that. That's certainly helped me out. I'm very grateful I wasn't shot up, damaged, or killed, certainly. And it's made me very aware of the stories of others. I feel a sort of camaraderie with any veteran, but especially the Vietnam veterans, although I've never kept in touch with any of the people there. I guess there were only 3 or 4 others that I had served with over there who didn't get blown away by the time I left. So where their lives led, I don't know afterwards. But I was never, like I said, I was never bonding with others over there out of some great need. While I was there, I was always coming back to others that I would, so. And that's what I did. As soon as I got back, I was immersed in university culture, theater culture, other new friends, et cetera, and I never hung on to social attachments of others. So I guess in general, I'm glad I did that. I probably would have lacked a lot if I'd never seen what goes on there. I don't have any illusions. I probably did enter with a lot of illusions about being patriotic and how fun war is, when you can be like John Wayne and all the other heroes you saw in the movies. I no longer have that. I certainly am, as I said, very suspicious about the people who support the war and the money it takes to support the war and all that good stuff. It certainly made me also very knowledgeable about what George Bush and now Donald Trump and others have done in applying military force around the world, I tend to know what's going on when they, bomb Tunisia or send some rockets into Syria, and what these guys are going through in the Philippines and that sort of stuff. I know what's happening a little more, I think, without having to rely on Hollywood to tell me that or read a bunch of books. I've read a lot of books about Vietnam afterwards, helped to put it in perspective by a bunch of people. My favorite kinds are the stories of it, not so much the critical analyses and the political arguments, but the stories of it. And I confess those are the most, my favorite motion pictures are films that I feel really depict what was going on, what I saw going on. So,
give me an example, since we're both in the art field. What kind of movies are you talking about? Which ones in particular struck you?
there are probably four. The most important one was Coppola's film, Apocalypse Now. There are many aspects of that are just ultimately very, very real. The, the one scene where in the middle of the jungle, suddenly everything lights up because they're flying in a bunch of entertainers from Hollywood, and there's no light in the jungle. We'd go out on patrol. There was nothing but starlight, But in the movie, you got that sense of suddenly there's that base, that landing pad, and that forward fire base, and light it up. And for an hour, the helicopters would come in, and the gals and guys would go out there and dance, et cetera, et cetera. And then they'd fly them right out, or whatever. But there's a lot of scenes in that film that I think were...
It's a scary film, too.
It is scary, but nothing is unreal. The only thing that's unreal is the notion of going way up a river, like, was it Martin Sheen, trying to find Marlon Brando, who's some weird guy where they're doing cannibalism, and stuff. That whole thing, well, he had to do that because it was based on the Joseph Conrad novel, but I don't think anyone was really that psychopathic like Marlon Brando. However, everything that happened around that was real. A second one was Platoon with Willem Dafoe and others. That was absolutely real. The combat sequences, the rivalry and hatreds and people, and going on with your own people. The combat sequences were really accurate, really reflected what I knew. And there was another one called Full Metal Jacket, which it seemed to be a really brutal war films, but they showed it the way it was. And so those really impressed me. Well, but it was probably Platoon that had an ethical dimension to it, like Apocalypse Now had an ethical dimension to it that put it into an accurate perspective.
We were talking about Hollywood. The interesting thing is how long it took Oliver Stone to actually get that made. He had to make a whole bunch of other ones because nobody wanted to make it.
The final film I'd mention is the one that was made long after the war, and it wasn't so much about combat at all. It was Swimming to Cambodia, where they were talking about the killing fields.
Sure.
That motion picture was real.
Spalding Gray.
That was Spalding Gray, yeah. God have mercy on that guy. But he did a good job in that film.
Fantastic.
And you got the sense of panic of what it was like when the embassy staff had to get out of Saigon, like now. And so that really was good for me, yeah. So
I don't want to sound facetious because I love this movie. What did you think of Forrest Gump?
Oh, I liked it. It was very playful.
It had its moments, though, where this person who really didn't have any concept of what was going on around him, but had somehow this moral compass that, I got to say, Bubba, kind of thing, still brings...
Bubba Hanks.
Yeah, it still comes to tears to my eyes whenever I see that scene where he just goes running back and grabbing those people because he doesn't know any better. I mean, it's just the right thing to do.
There were a lot of Bubbas who would make it through there and would be different Bubbas when they went back to Louisiana, Alabama, New York, wherever. But at the same time, there were a lot of folks who went back to the streets who had been, especially the African Americans, Latinos. They went back toughened for a race war that still pretty real to a lot of our cities nowadays, and it was certainly real back then, the civil rights time that coincided with all that. So, but there were a lot of Bubbas in there, and yeah, he had a moral compass and all. It was a wonderful film, good contrast between his buddy who got shot up and all, and Forrest Gump who was just trying to do the right thing all the time. He took his chances, and the roll of the dice was just he lived, and the other guy got torn up. I mean, that's what happens.